Alright, so I wanted to talk about one thing in spirituality which I've noticed, and I think it's quite dangerous or bad, and that is the idea of passive detaching or removing yourself from doing anything. You know, I've heard this being called bypassing, or just kind of spiritual, I guess, ignoring. And specifically when it relates to like our inner work, our trauma, our shadow work, and insecurities, things we really need to work on and confront, you know, directly, head on, if we're actually going to fix them, if we're actually going to solve them and learn from them. It doesn't work to just ignore it. It'll be like if your house is burning down, and the people basically say, well, just think positive thoughts and it will go away. That's not the case. Although positive thoughts have an influence on it, usually, and in my opinion, we're here to learn lessons, have experiences, and go through changes or growth. You can't do those things if you just completely ignore and kind of divert from doing that work, from doing that inner healing and confronting these traumas. And this is especially the case if you have trauma, like real trauma. If you have trauma from when you were younger, especially in your formative years, you can't fix that by just ignoring it or pretending it didn't happen. And in fact, when you do pretend it didn't happen, that's almost the textbook definition of mental disorders. Things like schizophrenia and these other mental protective mechanisms we have as a response to trauma. And, you know, this is well researched. That's not a solution, as any person who's been studying things like schizophrenia will tell you. That's not a solution. In many cases, that makes things much worse. And so this idea of bypassing and just kind of not doing the work and ignoring the problem is almost the same thing, because you don't fix the problem. So in my opinion, it seems like we're here, and whatever you want to call this, right? The hologram, the divine matrix, the illusion, right? Whatever this you want to call this experience of life. We're certainly here for a reason, I think. And I think in many ways we chose to be here. At least that's the only belief that to me makes sense. And so then ask yourself, why did we choose to be here? It probably wasn't to just have problems or difficult situations and then ignore those problems. My guess is that we're here to go through problems and difficult situations in order to grow, and in order to, using our free will, choose love or fear, and therefore sort ourselves into one end of the polarity which we find ourselves in. That's my opinion. But from what I can see, what you're doing by, let's say there's something bad happening. I'm really simplifying this now. Something bad's happening, and you've been told by various spiritual influences to just think positive thoughts and it will go away. Well, that's not true. I mean, we can see that's not true. We can see that doesn't happen, because if you look at the world now, we find ourselves, for whatever reason, in a situation where a small group of people are trying to impose and get away with very dangerous agendas, let's call it that, and they have a very specific idea of what they want humanity to look like, which none of us actually want. Now, that's the case. Let's say if you were in a specific country where they locked down the whole place, or they restricted the whole thing. The people thinking positive thoughts in that country aren't somewhere else. You know, they're in the same situation. They're in the same reality that we all are in. They might be able to pretend they're not for a while, but the truth is they are. Like, let's say if you were in Australia right now, really, really crazy things going on there, right? I mean, in some places you can't leave your house, you can't leave the country, you can't cross borders. Now, obviously that's pretty bad, right? From a sovereignty point of view, but there are people who think they are not living in that situation just because they're thinking positive thoughts about the Ascension timeline and Golden Age. And although positive thoughts are good and they have an influence, they're not in a different reality, you know? So I think we need to be aware of this and be kind of more neutral and take a step back and just think, okay, I'm in this situation, let's be aware of it, let's just call it what it is, and work out then where we go from there, instead of pretending it's not happening. Because if you pretend it's not happening, it's probably going to get worse. And another thing that I like to do sometimes is try and put myself in the position of the people doing this. If you were trying to get away with this stuff, right, enslavement of humanity or whatever, the best outcome you could hope for, the best situation would be if nobody resisted you. And so how do you get people to not resist you? Well, you promote the idea that it's happening for a reason, and by detaching from it and not doing anything physically and thinking positive thoughts, it will go away, when the net result is you've just deactivated the only people who would resist you. And we've seen this, you know, the less resistance there is, the more they do, the more they can get away with. Not that we should be physically resisting or anything like that, but at least saying, you know, comfortably and calmly saying no to things and speaking about this stuff and talking about it and asking questions. That's really important, I think. And then once you have that as like the foundation, then, you know, add on the positive thinking, the affirmations, and the other side of this, which is, okay, we don't want that scenario, so what do we want? You know, what world do we actually want to create together? Because there has to be something. There has to be some kind of system. Otherwise it will be anarchy. So if we don't want the NW0 situation, then what do we want, you know? And what would that look like? I think that's equally important as saying what we don't want, is saying, well, okay, what's the alternative then? What should we create?